"We've chosen another candidate." That was it. Just 6 words. No explanation. No second glance. Just the sound of a pen tapping against glass and the finality in her voice. Marco blinked. Once, slowly, like he hadn't heard her right. But he had. He knew he had. Behind the polished desk, Alessandra Ferrari didn't flinch. She closed the folder with his resume inside as though it were just another sheet of paper in a stack of failures. From where he sat, Marco could see Sophia's tiny reflection in the glass door outside the office. Her legs dangled off the waiting bench, swinging back and forth, oblivious to the fact that everything was falling apart on the other side, he had told her. Today might be the day, Piccolina. He believed it himself. The clock ticked again, sharp, metallic, cutting into the silence. He should say something. Anything. But his throat was dry. His fists clenched just beneath the desk, knuckles white. This wasn't just a rejection. This was a judgment. A verdict on who he was. Not as a mechanic, but as a father. Alessandra's voice remained composed. Almost rehearsed. "We appreciate your interest in Ferrari, Mr. Rossi. And your passion is evident. But our environment demands complete flexibility. An uninterrupted focus. Your circumstances, as they stand, raise certain concerns." There it was. Polished discrimination dressed as professionalism. Marco opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He forced himself to breathe. "I can be flexible," he said quietly. "I've worked 12-hour shifts in race garages. I've rebuilt engines blindfolded with timers on. I can." Alessandra raised one manicured hand. "It's not about your skills," she interrupted. "It's about stability. Reliability. We need someone who can be fully available at all times. You're a single parent, Mr. Rossi." The way she said it, flat, final, like being a father was a flaw in his resume, Marco swallowed hard. Through the glass, Sophia's sketchbook flipped in her lap, catching a beam of sunlight. A red Ferrari, drawn in crayon, with 2 stick figures in front. One tall, one small. That he looked away before his heart cracked right there in the chair. Outside, she looked up from her drawing, as if she could sense it. Something was wrong. Marco stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the polished floor. He gathered his documents. Though Alessandra hadn't glanced at them once during the entire meeting, she didn't stand. Just offered a thin, professional nod. "Best of luck, Mr. Rossi." He hesitated a beat. Waiting for what? A change of heart? A human moment? It didn't come to as he opened the glass door. The sound of the humming factory beyond swelled slightly. Hot air and engine whirs bled into the sterile silence of the office. Sophia jumped up from her seat. "Well?" she asked brightly, eyes wide. Marco forced a smile. "The kind that hurt." "Let's go get gelato," he said, his voice light, betraying. "Nothing. Stracciatella, right?" Sophia beamed and grabbed his hand. But as they walked past the test bay corridor, Marco didn't see the cars. He saw Alessandra's face and the sentence he couldn't shake. "You're a single parent, Mr. Rossi." As if that made him unreliable. As if loving his daughter made him less of a man. That night, Marco sat at the kitchen table long after Sophia had gone to bed. Her drawing lay beside his untouched coffee. Red Ferrari, stick figures, sunshine in the corner. A dream captured in crayon. He stared at it for a long time. There had been no comments about his technical skills. No challenge to his qualifications. Just that word again, circumstances. A polite code for your too much trouble. Outside, the distant hum of a motorbike buzzed past. In the silence that followed, Marco lowered his head into his hands. "I thought my hands, my work, my passion would speak for me. But all she saw was the weight I carry. She didn't see the strength behind it." He thought about Sophia, the hope in her voice, the trust in her drawing. And a quiet resolve began to flicker beneath the shame. Have you ever been overlooked? Not because you lacked the skill, but because someone assumed your life made you less capable? If that hits home, drop your story in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this matter, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. 3 years ago, the world Marco knew ended on a wet road outside Bologna. They said the brakes failed. They said nothing could have been done. What they didn't say was how a man was supposed to explain to a 7-year-old why her mother wasn't coming home. After the funeral, Marco sold their car. He couldn't look at it anymore. Not because it was wrecked, but because they'd built it together. His wife had loved machines like he did. Fast ones, loud ones, difficult ones. She'd said every engine had a soul if you listened close enough. In the months that followed, he learned how to cook, how to braid hair, how to sit through school recitals and parent-teacher meetings alone. The grief never left, but Sophia did what children somehow always managed to do. She kept moving forward, laughing, drawing, asking questions. Marco worked in a neighborhood garage back then. Nights were the only time he could pick up extra shifts. Customers left with tuned engines and polished hoods, never knowing the man who fixed their cars barely slept, barely spoke, and barely made rent. His hands stayed busy because his heart couldn't be. He told himself it was for Sophia. But sometimes, late at night, he wasn't sure if that was truth or an excuse to stay distracted. The only constant was the sound of tools clinking against metal and the faint humming from the corner where Sophia sat on a folded blanket, drawing cars in thick crayon strokes, red ones. Always red. The garage was small, just enough space for 3 vehicles, a workbench, and a wall calendar nobody ever turned. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The heater rattled in winter and died completely in summer. But it was honest work, and that was more than most could say. Giovanni Bianchi visited occasionally. A retired Ferrari engineer with a cane in one hand and old racing scars on both knuckles. He wasn't there for the business. He was there for Marco. "You still tuning by ear?" Giovanni would say, leaning against the wall while Marco adjusted timing belts. "You've got the touch, just like your wife did." They'd worked together once, briefly, before Giovanni retired. He had always seen something in Marco that others missed: intuition, grit, precision. "Ferrari's opening up a position," he said one evening, watching Marco rebuild a gearbox without looking at the manual. "You should apply." Marco wiped his hands on a rag. "They don't hire neighborhood mechanics." Giovanni smiled. "They don't know you're not just a mechanic." That night, after Sophia was asleep, Marco sat in front of his computer and stared at the job listing. The logo alone made his pulse shift. Ferrari. It wasn't just a brand. It was a legacy. His and his wife's shared dream. He filled out the form, rewrote his resume, attached letters of recommendation. Giovanni even made a call to someone he trusted on the inside. For once, hope didn't feel foolish. It felt overdue. A week after the rejection, the letter still sat on the kitchen table, folded, untouched. Its presence filled the room even when no one looked at it. Bills surrounded it, some unopened, some marked past due. Marco stirred cold coffee in slow circles and didn't drink it. His thoughts kept replaying the words. "Your situation complicates things." Not, "Your skills aren't strong enough." Not, "We found someone more experienced." Just that. A situation. Sophia sat on the floor nearby, humming a tune and using every red crayon she had to finish her newest sketch. Another Ferrari, this time with her name on the side. She looked up. "Are you sad, Papa?" Marco blinked. "No, tesoro. Just thinking." "About Mama?" He paused, then nodded. "About everything." She stood, walked to the table, and placed her drawing on top of the unopened letter. "You'll get there, Papa," she said. "You always fix things." His throat tightened. That was the moment. More than the rejection, more than Alessandra's words, that chipped something inside him. Not out of pain, out of pressure. She believed in him, without condition, without knowing what the world had told him, and somehow, that belief stung worse than the rejection, because it meant giving up wasn't an option. That night, Marco walked back into the garage after dinner. The space felt colder, older, as if the missed opportunity had taken something from the walls. He picked up the letter and stared at the words again. Every sentence wrapped in polite, corporate phrasing. But all he read was a dismissal of his entire life. His hands trembled as he tore it in half, then again. It landed in the bin, silent and final. The sound of Sophia's small feet padded into the room behind him. "I brought you something," she said, holding a warm mug between both hands. "Cocoa." She looked around at the cluttered bench, the oily rags, the half-built transmission case, then carefully climbed onto the old stool by the wall. "I made this today." She pulled a new drawing from her pocket, another red Ferrari. Only this time there were 3 figures drawn outside the car. Marco, Sophia, and a woman she still remembered in pieces. He took it carefully, wiping grease from his fingers first. "You'll work there one day," she said with certainty. "Maybe I will too." He sat beside her. For once, the machines didn't make a sound. Neither did the tools. But something inside him clicked back into place. Later that week, Marco stood outside Giovanni's apartment, holding a folded blueprint and 2 envelopes. One was a second draft of his resume. The other was an annotated response to every technical question he'd received during the interview. He wasn't giving up. Giovanni opened the door, eyes narrowing. "You look like a man who's done thinking." Marco handed him the papers. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for a second chance." Giovanni stepped aside and let him in. Inside, the walls were covered with racing photos, engines from the 70s, team pit stops, group shots with younger men who now ran departments. There was a time when Giovanni's voice carried weight in rooms that made decisions. "I'll make the call," he said finally, eyes scanning the documents. "But this time, let's give them something they can't ignore." That night, Marco slept for the first time in days. Not because the road ahead was clear, but because it finally had direction. Sophia curled beside him on the couch, their new drawing taped to the wall above them. Would you keep fighting if the world kept telling you to give up? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonates, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you're here for what happens next. 10 minutes into the second interview, Marco knew he was wasting his breath. Alessandra didn't look up from the screen. Her desk was as pristine as before. Her tone was clipped, her gestures efficient. The same office, the same chair. But this time, there was no hesitation in her dismissal, only control. "I received the documents you submitted," she said coolly, fingers tapping across the keyboard. "I appreciate the effort, Mr. Rossi. However, the decision has already been made." Marco stayed seated. He had rehearsed his words. Not begging, not pleading, just honest. "I know the demands here are high. I know this isn't an easy job. But raising a child alone doesn't make me unreliable. It makes me resourceful." She closed the laptop. "Our team needs full availability. No sudden absences. No family complications." He blinked. "My daughter isn't a complication." The silence between them was tight. Alessandra stood. "We have no further openings at this time." Marco rose slowly, placing the revised documents on her desk anyway. "In case something changes." Her reply was instant. "It won't." As he reached for the doorknob, the chill of the metal struck harder than it should have. It matched the air in the room. On the other side of the door, there was no Sophia this time. Only the hollow sound of his own footsteps walking away. Back home, the apartment felt too quiet. Sophia was at a friend's house. The table was still covered in her sketches, a few scattered pieces of toast from breakfast, and the resume he had printed in triplicate. All of it stared back at him. Heavy and useless, he sat at the edge of the couch and leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes unfocused. The rejection had settled like a weight across his shoulders, not because of what was said, but because of how confidently it had been delivered. He replayed every sentence, every glance, every pause. Was it the mention of his daughter? Was it his last name? Was it the garage stains that wouldn't wash out of his nails, no matter how hard he scrubbed? He buried his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. The knock came mid-afternoon. A single knock, slow and firm. He opened the door to Giovanni, scarf knotted loosely, cane in hand. One look, and the old man knew. He didn't ask. "Sit," Giovanni said, stepping inside. Marco obeyed. Giovanni took in the clutter, the documents, the slumped shoulders. He didn't try to comfort. He simply sat across from him, hands folded over the cane, eyes narrowed. "This isn't about your work," Giovanni said finally. "It's about someone not willing to see past a title. Or a child." Marco said nothing. Giovanni stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking out over the street. "I've seen enough men fail because of their own mistakes. You didn't fail. They refused to see." Marco tried to speak. "Maybe I was too hopeful." Giovanni didn't turn around. "Hope's not the problem." He walked to the sideboard and picked up an old black and white photo. A younger Giovanni stood next to Enzo Ferrari, back when handshakes were contracts and trust mattered more than paperwork. "There was a time," Giovanni said, "when skill opened doors. Now it's spreadsheets and clean suits." He returned to the table and sat down again. "You've got every reason to be bitter. But bitterness doesn't feed your daughter. And it sure as hell won't build her future." Marco's eyes locked on the drawing still taped to the wall. "Red Ferrari." 3 figures. Her version of family. She thinks I can still get in, Marco said quietly. Giovanni raised an eyebrow. Can you? Marco nodded once. Yes. Giovanni exhaled through his nose. Then let's see if one last door's still open. He reached for his coat and pulled a small notepad from the inside pocket. The handwriting was barely legible, but the name was clear, Luca Moretti. I'll call him tonight, Giovanni said, voice like gravel. He still owes me a favor, and he listens when I say a man deserves a second look. Marco stood, unsure what to say. Giovanni gripped his cane and looked him squarely in the eye. This isn't how we treat family. Later that evening, the apartment remained quiet, save for the sound of Sophia humming in her room. Marco sat at the table, staring at the worn blueprint Giovanni had once helped him sketch years ago, a design modification they never submitted. He thought about all the nights spent in that garage, fixing what others tossed away. Thought about how hard it was to keep standing when everything around you told you to sit down and settle. Across the room, the phone rested on the counter, untouched. Not ringing, not moving, just sitting in wait that he could barely eat. Couldn't think straight. All he could do was hope that Giovanni's voice still carried weight. From the hallway, Sophia peeked in. Is it okay if I hang my drawing on your garage door? He nodded. It's yours too. She smiled and disappeared back. Down the hall, just as Marco stood to rinse out his cup, his phone vibrated once he froze. Looked at the screen. Unknown number that he let it ring. Just once more. Then he answered. Giovanni sat in his study with the phone in his hand and his cane resting against the edge of the desk. Old trophies stared down from the shelves, dull with time, but heavy with meaning. He tapped the number into the keypad slowly, the way a man does when he knows a single call might tilt someone's life back into balance. That he stood and began to pace. It took only 2 rings. Luca, he said without a pause. Recognition clicked on the other end. Giovanni. Haven't heard your voice in years. Everything all right? Depends on how much weight your word still carries in that building. Luca chuckled lightly. Enough to get someone looked at. Who's the candidate? Marco Rossi. Doesn't ring a bell. He applied. Got turned down. Well, that happens. Giovanni's tone didn't waver. It shouldn't have, not this time. He's better than most you've hired in the last decade. Engine specialist. Worked with me back when I still had grease on my hands. Luca paused again. Give me something real. A file. A clip. Something I can put in front of the right eyes. You'll have it by morning. Giovanni hung up and sat down again, breathing through his nose. He turned to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Marco's resume, work samples, technical breakdowns, and a video of him rebuilding a gearbox blindfolded, recorded on an old garage cam. He burned it all to a drive and sealed it in an envelope. The morning would take care of the rest. Luca Moretti arrived at his office just after 7. His assistant handed him the envelope marked with Giovanni's initials. That he didn't open it immediately. He placed it on his desk, poured himself a coffee, and stared at the vintage racing posters that lined the opposite wall. Back when things weren't run by metrics and policy guides. Back when trust in someone's word meant something. Eventually, he slid the USB into his laptop and watched. The video loaded grainy at first. Marco was in a garage, surrounded by engine parts. No music, no flair, just the work. He watched Marco piece together the internal frame of a Ferrari transmission without consulting a manual, his fingers moving with unbroken rhythm. Halfway through, the camera panned slightly. Sophia was seated nearby, scribbling in a notebook. Luca leaned forward. He played it again. Slower. Then he opened the PDF attached. Full diagnostic logs, job history, parts tested, stress test tolerances handwritten in the margins. A real technician. He picked up the phone and called HR. Pull up Marco Rossi's file, he said. Tell me why we passed. There was a delay. Then a response he didn't like. Reconsider. Him. Fast. Before hanging up, he sent one more message to Giovanni. He's in. I'll call him myself. The phone buzzed once. Marco looked at it, unsure if it was another bill reminder or telemarketer. The screen flashed. Unknown number. He answered without thinking. Mr. Rossi? The voice on the other end was smooth. Professional. Yes. This is Luca Moretti from Ferrari. I've reviewed your application and materials. Giovanni spoke highly of you. And I see now, for good reason. Marco didn't speak. His heart was suddenly beating in places he didn't think had nerves. We'd like to extend an offer. Mechanic technician, specialized in engine calibration. Starting in 2 weeks, full benefits, relocation covered if needed. Does that interest you? Marco let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped for days. Yes, he said, trying to keep it even. Excellent. We'll send everything over shortly. The call ended. He sat still for a moment. The silence was warm. Reeled out he stood, turned toward the kitchen, and called out. Sophia. She came running in. What is it? He crouched down to her level. We're in. She blinked. At Ferrari? He nodded. She squealed and hugged him, nearly knocking him over. I knew it. I told you. He lifted her and spun. Once, barely noticing the pasta on the stove starting to boil over, they didn't care. Dinner could wait. The table that night wasn't fancy. Just 2 plates of spaghetti, garlic bread from the oven, and a salad neither of them touched. Marco barely ate. He kept watching Sophia, who danced around the kitchen humming songs she made up on the spot. He couldn't remember the last time the apartment felt this light. Giovanni called just after 9. She screamed. Didn't she? He asked, voice rumbling. With a low laugh, she nearly took the ceiling down. I told you. You were never the problem. They just needed someone to say it louder. Marco smiled. Thank you. No thanks needed. Just promise me one thing. What's that? When you get in there, stay exactly the man you are. Don't polish yourself to fit them. Let them adjust to you. I will. After the call, Marco tucked Sophia into bed. She clutched a new drawing in her hands. A red Ferrari, same as always, but this time it had a small logo at the bottom that read Team Rossi. As he switched off the light, she whispered, Told you you'd fix it, Papa. He leaned down, kissed her forehead. Sometimes, the key isn't what you know, it's who truly believes in you. And when they speak up, doors don't just open, they never close the same way again. Marco zipped up the crimson Ferrari jumpsuit, its fabric still stiff from the newness. The patch over his chest read, Rossi. Simple, direct, earned, the factory. Floor was alive with precision. Pneumatic tools hissing, calibration monitors blinking, and the muffled murmur of engineers exchanging data. A deep warmth filled the air, part from the testing engines, part from knowing he belonged. He stood beside an F8 Tributo, the hood open, panels exposed like a machine mid-conversation. Marco leaned in, eyes narrowing as he adjusted the camshaft. Readings by feel more than sight. His tools clicked into place with a quiet confidence. This wasn't just labor, it was a language. From the observation room above, Sophia watched through the glass, a sketchpad on her lap. She didn't move much, but her pencil never stopped. She had drawn the car below 6 times already, each with subtle differences only she could explain. Marco glanced up once, caught her eye, and smiled. She waved, barely lifting her hand, but the joy in her face needed no translation. Back to the engine. There was still work to do, but for the first time, it didn't feel like chasing survival. It felt like shaping something lasting. Later that afternoon, Marco stepped into the locker room to wash up. The stainless steel sink hissed as he scrubbed. Oil from his fingers. The heat from the testing bay still lingered on his arms that he glanced at the mirror. Tired eyes, yes, but sharper. Grounded. He didn't flinch at his reflection anymore. At AS, he turned to leave. A younger technician, early 20s, clipboard in hand, hovered near the bench. Excuse me, the young man said. You're Marco Rossi, right? Marco nodded. I read your diagnostics from this morning. I've been trying to understand your adjustments to the intake settings on the Tributo. Marco motioned to the bench. Sit. They talked engines for 20 minutes. Not big theories, practical applications, real fixes. The young man asked thoughtful questions, took fast notes, and listened. Before parting, Marco offered him a quiet piece of advice. When the specs don't match the instinct, trust your hands. The intern smiled. That's what Mr. Bianchi used to say. Marco paused. You knew him? He taught a class I took before joining here. Spoke about you once. Said you rebuilt something most people would have walked away from. Marco swallowed. The compliment landed somewhere deep as they exited the locker room. They crossed paths with Alessandra. She walked past without stopping, but for the first time, she nodded. Respectful. Wordless. Enough. That evening, the factory lights dimmed, down to a soft golden glow. Most of the crew had gone. Only a few engines still purred in the background like well-fed animals settling in for rest. Marco walked with Sophia down the main corridor, her sketchpad under one arm, her free hand in his. She stopped to stare at a completed car on display, its body smooth and silent. The hum of the showroom music played faintly overhead, low piano notes that didn't need attention but shaped the air just the same. "I think this one's my favorite," she whispered. "Why?" "Because you worked on it." He knelt beside her. "One day, you'll do more than draw them. You'll build them better than I ever could." She grinned. "Only if I get to wear red, too." He laughed. "It's the rule." They continued walking. When they reached the exit, Marco looked back once at the floor, the place that had nearly shut its doors on him. And yet here he was, not only accepted but valued. His presence no longer questioned. His work no longer second-guessed. He didn't say much about it. He didn't have to. As they stepped into the evening air, warm from the last rays of sun, Marco looked down at Sophia. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "The doors we knock on don't always open. But when they do, what we do next defines everything. I couldn't change their minds. But someone believed in me. And that changed what came after. Would you have made that call? Would you stand up for someone the world tried to ignore?" Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if stories like this speak to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.